news and current affairs. And Egypt have welcomed a two-day Egyptian-Sudanese summit following the tripartite ministerial meeting that took place in Egypt also over the Renaissance Dam issue. The Sudanese-Egyptian talks that we are talking about today that followed that ministerial meeting focused on the bilateral relations and the points of mutual concern, but on top of all it reflected important steps taken to reflect that this is a move that is past the strains in relationship or beyond the strains in relationship between Sudan and Egypt over the divergent views over the Nile sources and the border disputes and everything. And for ages, Sudan and Egypt have shared the different cultural and political and historical and common political interests. But Sudan is also keen in maintaining the relationship with the strong Egypt that have that overcame the challenges, the ideological and political and different challenges strongly, and became what it came now. And while other countries, neighboring countries, have these challenges have taken other neighboring countries to indefinite or unknown destinations until this very moment. And of course, Sudan is keen on maintaining these relationships with Egypt. And these relationships, if it's maintained with Egypt, is going to take Sudan to a new leverage. We're going to shed some light on the possible or the new relations between Sudan and Egypt. If it's a new chapter in the life of Egypt and Sudan, and where is it going to take both countries, especially that they share a lot of common interests together. And we're very delighted to have with us Dr. Mohanna, the political analyst. Good evening, Dr. Mohanna.
Good evening, and thanks for having me.
And let us first start by the President Bashir's visit to Egypt, which is the first of its kind after ousting the Brotherhood regime. How do you see this visit, and what is the significance as a first step taken on Sudan's part?
I think the relationship between Egypt and Sudan, as well as the number of other relationships in Africa, were affected in the past few years. And I think the visit of Mr. Bashir to Egypt is to restore the relationship, especially, as you kindly mentioned earlier, they share a number of interests, particularly the crisis of the Grand Dam of Ethiopia. There were a number of issues in dispute, such as Halab and Shalatin and the border issues, the security forces smuggling of drugs and weapons through the southern border, some of the problems of the tribes in the south. And I think they also agreed to level up the level of communication to the highest level, to the president level, rather than to the government level. So I think it's a new start now. And I think a lot of that goes back to the crisis they're facing together concerning the Dam of Ethiopia, and also to stand united in the face of terrorism, Daesh, and the dangers coming from Libya. So we're hoping that it will be a new start, a new page in the relationship between Egypt and Sudan, and also the relationship between Egypt and the South Sudan after the split of South Sudan. And we do have a number of problems there, mainly humanitarian problems, and Egypt is quite involved in the relief of problems in South Sudan. So I think the relationship with North Sudan, or the main Sudan, is actually going to help Egypt regain its position in Africa, and particularly the leadership position when it comes to development and on the political sphere as well.
Right. This meeting or these talks is a continuation or a resumption of what was between the two leaders back in Khartoum when President Sisi visited Khartoum after the AU summit. So how do you see that summit taking place? Is it a continuation of what happened in Khartoum earlier?
Definitely. I think President
Sisi's
vision when it comes to the relationship with Africa, and particularly the African brothers, mainly in Sudan and the rest of the Arab countries, I think they're quite aware of his vision, quite aware of his policy around the regaining the relationship and restoring the relationship with Africa. So definitely, as you said, it is a continuation of the previous summits, and we'll definitely see more.
Is it a continuation or a total different stance?
No, I think it is a continuation, because the number of issues rising here are exactly the same. the border, the smuggling, halab and shalatin, and the economic cooperation, as well as the dam of Ethiopia. So more or less are the same topics. So I think it is a continuation, and here it is a confirmation of the relationship between Egypt and Sudan, that it is strong and it is a lot bigger than any differences, and that's definitely what we're hoping for, that the relationship will be restored fully to what it was before.
Right. The visit by President al-Bashir followed the meeting between the Egyptian, Sudanese, and Ethiopian irrigation and water resources ministers, where the issue of the Renaissance Dam was highly raised and discussed in details. The issue has been the subject of controversy between the 3 African members. They agreed to take a final report of the 12 experts that were presented in the summit earlier here in Egypt, and a final report is going to be issued on December 7th, expected.
They're going to wait for the consultants to issue that report. I think the dam of Ethiopia really raises a number of issues, not just on the water security, but on a political sphere, the safety of the dam itself, and what it covers, the issue of water and irrigation. So if we look at the dam, just to give viewers an idea, the dam was basically designed to generate close to 6,000 megawatt of electricity, and I think there is a lot of criticism around that, because it comprises 17 turbines, and 10 of them will only be used for 3 months during the high flow of the river. So here is a technical problem, which basically means that it's not going to generate more than 2,100 megawatt. So the propaganda around the dam is not going to really help Ethiopia the way they actually promoting it. And that basically takes us to another issue, that the problem could be, or it is actually a political problem, where we see a threat to the national security of Egypt and the Sudan. If we look at the number of negative aspects of how the dam will affect Egypt and Sudan, basically looking at losing 11 to 19% of the water due to evaporation. We're talking about a reduction of water level in the Nasser Lake and the water behind the dam in Egypt, the high dam in Egypt, leading to a loss of an amount of electricity generated by the high dam, calculated I think at about 100 megawatt. We're talking about the electricity supply in Egypt could be affected between 25 and 40%, which basically can lead to crisis on the industrial area in Egypt. And more than that, we're talking about a negative effect on the farmers. Close to 2 million farmers will lose their jobs or an income during the filling of the dam, because the dam will probably take close to a year and a half to fill up, and that basically will reduce the amount of water temporarily wise or on a temporary basis during filling the dam. And the permanent reduction of water level will be due to evaporation. And we're talking about the reservoir is about 1,680 square kilometers, so it's a large area and a lot of evaporation that Egypt in the end will be affected by losing a lot of water.
That is the possible threat towards Egypt. But while Sudan also is enjoying its share of the Nile water before according to the colonial agreement, it is also sharing the threats, possible threats.
Absolutely, absolutely, because the water that will reach Sudan and Egypt will be a lot less. Sudan gets about 18.5 billion cubic meter of water, but I think the dam will help them to actually maintain better the dams they have because of the water pressure. So they do have some benefits, but I think in the amount of water that will reach Sudan, they will be affected exactly the same way Egypt is affected. On the energy side, yes, Sudan will be definitely affected the same way. But I think because Egypt is a downstream, is the last one, so the amount of water cannot be increased any further. So whatever we receive is whatever we're going to really work on, whether the water that we have in the Lake Nasser and the water behind the high dam, and basically working out the turbines, and then will, looking at the engineers or experts, basically stated that will affect the generation of electricity on the high dam, plus the irrigation system in Egypt.
But also experts ruled out the possibility of the dams, if it collapses.
That's right.
There is going to be an imminent threat on Khartoum first.
That's right. There is a problem with the soil.
Which is on top of all the threats.
That's right. There is the soil or the ground on which the dam will be built in Ethiopia, it's not really that stable. It's rocky in some areas and is muddy in other areas. So there is a lot of technical faults in the dam. And basically the soil area, and secondly the number of turbines. It's quite large to have a 17 turbine on this amount of dam. It's 1,800 meters long and 160. So that's number one. And the problem here is that the water flow in that particular area gets about 6,000 per second. A cubic meter per second. So what we're talking about here is not going to generate, as the experts say, more than 2,000 megawatt. So the amount of effort and the structure that was designed for the dam is not really required. It's not going to help Ethiopia that much, and on the same time the negative aspects are quite severe, particularly for Egypt as a downstream.
Benefits.
That's right.
But in spite of all that, we don't see Sudan sharing the same reaction. If we talk about the reaction, Sudan is not sharing the same reaction with Egypt in rejection, the way it rejects the issue of constructing the Renaissance Dam.
That's right. I think because of two main reasons. Number one, they have certain differences with the Egyptian government concerning the border. And the area of Halab and Shiratim, and God knows what the ex-president really did, whether he really agreed to give Halab and Shiratim to Sudan, or what he did, we actually don't know. So the negotiations are going, and Sudan still insists that Halab is a Sudanese land, including it in the next electoral round. So we do have a problem in that particular area. So the atmosphere is not quite clear yet to restore the relationship, and I think President Sisi and the government exchanging ideas around how to restore the relationship away from Halab and Shalatin. So that's number one issue that is really not keeping them quite happy about actually supporting Egypt against Ethiopia in that particular area. Secondly, the river is passing through them. It affects mainly the downstream country, which is Egypt. It's the last one on the line. We're talking about 10 countries that the basin goes through, covering about 3.3 million square meters. So there's a lot of land that the basin covers, but the downstream country is Egypt, and I think the major effect here is large. The other issue that we have in terms of the type of land in Egypt versus Sudan, Sudan enjoys heavy rains. They have a good soil, but Egypt has desert. So the water shortage in Sudan is not going to affect them that much. The population size is not that huge. But if you look at the consequences on Egypt, you're talking about close to 100 million people. You're talking about 5 million acres. You're talking about a large population that is very concentrated in a small area. So if the water shortage really should occur, Egypt will really suffer quite a lot on the irrigation and food supply, and on top of that on the energy supply, affecting the industrial sector of Egypt completely, and transportation.
Right. Of course, earlier to the Egyptian-Sudanese summit, there was a tripartite ministerial meeting that gathered the three ministers of irrigation and water resources. Now with the Renaissance Dam entering its 40% stage now, or more than 40% stage in construction, there is a committee of 12 experts that are supposed to present another report and new studies. But the question here is, what will this report offer more than the former one? Is it the issue of expertise or the importance of Ethiopia abiding to the new studies?
I think the experts will study really the rights of Egypt to the quota presented in the agreement of 1959. Which basically included a number of countries. Now we're talking about 10 countries that were never there when the agreement of 1959 was drawn. So these countries are now asking for their allocation of water as well. So, and those countries, the 10 countries are now gathered, or 9 countries gathered to sign a new Antigua agreement to basically, cancel the old one, which is our right to refuse, because it's an international agreement and it's been recorded in the United Nations, so cannot just ignore it, because it affects our rights and allocation in water. I think the experts here are trying to play a neutral role in presenting their findings throughout the study of the technical aspects of the dam, the benefits to Ethiopia from the dam, because we might have an alternative to Ethiopia to generate electricity with the help of Egypt, rather than building a dam and affecting the rest of the countries. So they're going to study all options, and they're going to look at the benefits to Ethiopia versus the negative aspects that will really get to Egypt and Sudan, and particularly Egypt. And in the end, they're going to present their findings. And I think it's not going to be that easy, because Ethiopia insists, and they're right to have a dam, and it's also our right to protect our water, because it's a national security matter. So we will just have to wait and see what the findings could be, but it might escalate, because if the findings really see that Ethiopia has the right to have that dam at this size, at this shape, so this is not going to help Egypt at all, because we're talking about, as I said earlier, 11 to 19% loss of water that's coming to Egypt, a reduction in the water level in the Nasser lake, and a reduction in the capacity in terms of generating the high dam capacity to generate electricity by 100 megawatt. So in the end, we're talking about a reduction in energy in that particular sector, 25 to 40%, and it's going to affect everything in Egypt. So
right, from what we see happening here and assessing the whole situation, and with Ethiopia being stubborn on its stance and not abiding to all the expertise committees that issue the new studies every time, but with the change in the course of events and the renew of the bilateral ties between Sudan and Egypt, and Egypt and Sudan, like I earlier mentioned, have gone beyond the strains in the relationships, and they have been overcoming the diverging in views over all the issues and the border disputes and everything. Will that be able to change the scene once the studies are issued, are presented, and Ethiopia doesn't abide? What would happen then?
The power that really gave Ethiopia, or the aspect that gave Ethiopia the power to start the dam, was the signature of the 8 countries on the new agreement. So without these 8 countries signing to have a new allocation of water, Ethiopia wouldn't really have the courage to start something like that. That's number one. Number two, we're talking about $4.8 billion over 4 years, and this is basically close to 60% of the budget. So it's a huge amount to Ethiopia. Ethiopia doesn't have the resources, and they're collecting money like Uganda and the rest of countries are offering really shares, because they're selling bonds on the dam to basically collect money to provide the financial resources required. So in terms of how the scene will change, the number of countries that have agreed previously to sign the agreement will have to basically return on that decision and try to solve it through a diplomatic means. Number two, restoring the relationship and the ties between Egypt and Sudan basically will help the two sides to stand firm against Ethiopia's plan. And number three, we've got a major political and international players such as United States, France, and a number of countries in Europe, China, Israel. These countries are really participating in the development in Africa, and I think if they are convinced that the dam will affect badly the life overall in Sudan and Egypt, I think the scene will change. And I think there must be thereafter an international conference to try mutually discuss how we can help Ethiopia develop without the dam that is basically going to affect everybody. So what are the alternatives that we can offer Ethiopia as a replacement for the idea of building the dam?
But is the issue of alternatives have been raised in this ministerial meeting?
At the moment, no, because every side is just insisting on his views. Egypt has a legitimate refusal, because we do have an agreement based on 1959. You signed for it, and it's gone. If you have now a number of new countries, we can't change the agreement every time a new country comes up. And that really, the moment I heard, a while ago about the establishment of South Sudan, my worry was mainly on the more countries you have in the basin, the more problems you're going to have. Previously, you'd had 4 countries, settling their differences, but now you've got 10. You never know, you might have 12 or 15. So the more countries we have in the basin, the more problems we're going to have to deal with. And the problem comes back to us because as a downstream country, the last one is just going to have, is going to put it always on our way to take responsibility to help them find alternatives. Otherwise, they will basically argue that they need to develop, they need energy, and they need basically a new life for their people. And it's a legitimate request. So to prevent them from going through these agreements that will affect our national security overall, I think we will have to help them find alternatives. And that basically takes us back to the negligence in the international relations with Africa, because Africa needed Egypt, and I think the former President Mubarak ignored Africa quite a lot, and that's the main reason why we're sitting today with such a problem. But if we established strong ties and kept strong ties with Africa, I think would have really helped us in sorting out whatever problems we have and settle any differences that might come up, and also give Egypt the power and its hand in all African countries to be able to monitor what is happening there, and because it's a depth of our national security, Central Africa, and we all know that there is a lot of ties with Israel from Central African countries, a number of few millions, and particularly in South Africa, we're talking about millions of Jews in that particular continent, and they have strong loyalty to Israel. So we also have to be aware of
particularly in Ethiopia.
Exactly. So we're talking not just about development, we're talking about national security. They're trying to surround Egypt, not just from on the political sphere and terrorism. Now we're talking now about national security in terms of water shortage. We're talking about the flow of ships into the Suez Canal, with the problem with Aden and the split of South Yemen if it happens. So we're talking about a number of areas that we really have to redesign our foreign policy, particularly when it comes to Africa.
When we talk about Egypt and Sudan, we could easily see that Egypt has been the strategic northern gate to a country like Sudan. But on the other side, those particular 2 countries have shared way back years and years, I mean, cultural common interests and even national security and border interest and political interests together, mutual interests. So, but also another issue of conflict that has been going and dates back to, that has been ongoing and dates back to the colonial era is the Halayb Triangle.
Yeah.
So President al-Bashir have hinted to that issue or the border dispute in front of reporters, but he said clearly that Sudan is not going to go to war over this border dispute, but is seeking to resolve the dispute through the strong political will for bilateral relations to continue and flourish.
That's right.
What is the significance of that important phrase given by the Sudanese president?
Absolutely, that he's not going to discuss any of the problems that he might have with Egypt because they are brothers, so we're going to sort out all our differences.
Does that mean that they're going to freeze it?
No, we will discuss it, but behind closed doors. We're not going to discuss it in the international sphere because basically it allows a number of countries to really get in and, push the gap
and feed on
larger.
That's
right. I think the problem here goes back that Halayb and Shalatin is an area where, shepherds enjoy a large area for, camels and sheep and the rest of that, and never had really a wire in that particular area, and that basically came, we've started to hear about it 3 years ago, and unfortunately the former President Morsi has sat and discussed the issue in complete seriousness, which was never really required. So he put Egypt in in a light where we will have to negotiate around Halab and Shalatin. Egypt refused always to talk about Halab and Shalatin, and I think according to the maps that Egypt had from the colonial era, the southern border with Sudan is a straight line that basically includes Halab and Shalatin. And that particular area never had the wires, basically because they're just brothers and cousins from the north of Sudan and south of Egypt. So it never had really a border problem. So I think he's a wise man to say that, and he's referring that it's differences, or these are differences between brothers, and we will discuss it and resolve it behind closed doors, and we're not going to go into international sphere to allow anybody, as you said, to feed on it.
Right. Among the other points of mutual interest and common concerns that Sudan and Egypt have shared for years is the imminent threat of terrorism. As we all know, the jihadist militants, the extremist rights movements that have torn Sudan apart and robbed it of its national security and unity and its wealth.
That's and right. Almost, and a sanction for a few years.
Of course. And almost hit Egypt narrowly. But it failed. So this point of common interest between the two countries, what kind of strategies and obligations does it enforce on the future policies of the two countries, do you think? Especially, it's very important.
Absolutely. The Sudan paid a heavy price when it comes to terrorism, and if you go back a few years, you remember they were accused of hosting terrorists, and that's what really forced the major powers to, force sanctions on them for a few years, accusing them of bombing embassies and consulates and so on. And that really hammered the Sudanese economy. So I think they've learned the lesson, and now they're going to have to stand and pick a side, the right side to fight terrorism. They're not really in need to go through any accusations of being supportive to terrorism. However, their role was quite weak during or after June 30th revolution, because we found that a lot of terrorists have really tried to escape through the Sudanese border, which means that there is a security problem on that border, that through the cooperation between Egypt and Sudan, we need to redesign the management of that border to prevent smuggling of weapons and terrorists into that particular area. So definitely the Sudan represents the southern deep security of Egypt, and Egypt, as you said, is the northern gate. So they are really one part, and we've seen, the king of Egypt and Sudan up until 1953, when President Nasser really allowed them to split and have their own country. So I think now they need to understand that it's that, we next, Egypt and Sudan are next. Libya is completely destroyed. Syria is destroyed. There is a fear now that Daesh will get into Saudi Arabia and the Gulf area. So I think Egypt and Sudan will have to settle all the differences. And we don't want to say, just freeze it for now, but discuss it behind closed doors and give it time to settle all differences and be, united in the face of terrorism, because definitely, and we're talking particularly about the Red Sea. Because of the Suez Canal, the Aden Dam, and the problems in Yemen, and it's basically the western border of Saudi Arabia. This is the heart of the Islamic empire.
Of course.
So definitely they will really have to relook at how they manage the relationship again.
We also recall the Sudanese was also brought back on the panel of discussion concerning investment opportunities.
Yes.
How important is that?
Well, in the mega plan of Egypt, actually looking at a number of roads that will really link south of Egypt and the north of Sudan. We're talking about the Western Desert, Eastern Desert, and through the Nile River. So we're talking about, a great network of roads that will help in the trade movements between the two countries. I could foresee that Egypt and Sudan are going to go back to being one country again, at least economically, have a one currency, because I think you cannot really divide the two economies, the two countries. The two people are very similar, and I think this is one of the mistakes that President Nasser really did, is he allowing them to split. But I think we're going to have a better relationship between Egypt and Sudan, relying on the economic
Especially
resources
that they're
each
sharing
one.
the same problems.
Absolutely, and I think that the problems that face Egypt, the solution is in Sudan. You know, the wheat, the good agricultural land, which we don't have.
That's true.
They have a better water resources. So I think in that particular area, Sudan can be very helpful to Egypt, and Egypt can be very helpful on other areas, particularly on a political sphere, international relations, militarily as well, and in all other areas such as international trade, industrialization. So there is a number of areas that I can foresee that they will have a stronger relationship, and they have a mature relationship and a win-win situation. So definitely I could actually say that the visit of Mr. Bashir to Egypt and discussing man-to-man with or face-to-face with President Sisi is going to take Egypt and Sudan relationship into the next level. And we as people on a ground level, Egyptians and Sudanese, hope that we will reach that kind of level that we once had.
Right. There is also the West Nile Land Road that is linking the two countries together.
That's right.
And how important is it to establish that road in
Absolutely.
economically?
Yeah, the trade.
The trade. The free trade.
Yeah,
okay.
the flow of trade. We're talking about exports from ports as well. You might have, you know, certain ports exporting certain resources, and we're talking about the triangle, the golden triangle in the south of Egypt, and the excavation of a number of resources such as, you know, gold and steel and everything else. I think Sudan can play a major role in that, in helping Egypt trade to Africa, and Sudan can benefit economically through using Sudan roads as the gate of Egypt, or the Egyptian gate, southern gate to Africa. And also, I think culturally, there is a major part of the Sudanese culture that's close to the African culture. So I think Sudan can help Egypt as well through trade, roads, and cultural communication, is to help Egypt to restore the relationship with Africa, and I think everybody's going to benefit. So definitely we need, number one, is a good network of roads that allow Egyptians and Sudanese to move across the two countries and focusing on trade, tourism, and basically utilizing all resources in the south of Egypt and the north of Sudan.
Also, among the topics that were discussed is both Sudan and Egypt are going to be helping or supporting Libya's military against the jihadist militants to restore stability to the war-torn Libya. How important is that step to the national security of Sudan before Egypt?
I think
not only to Libya, not mentioning Libya.
Absolutely. I think I'd like to go back to 1990. I think the Arabs should learn the lesson that Western powers, or calling upon the Western powers into the Middle East, was a great mistake. And we've seen the damage that really took place in Iraq, the damage that is in Syria at the moment, the damage of NATO in Libya, and the major not just on infrastructure. We're talking about trade that stopped, the value of currencies that dropped, the lifestyle that is completely destroyed, and in the end, we paying the price. So there's a call that we've always seen, particularly in the last 3 years. We should activate the mega power of the Arab army under the Arab League, and that basically works exactly the same way as the United Nations security forces work. Each country will participate a number of troops or soldiers to have a unified troops under the flag of the Arab League, and in the end, these troops can be used with a supply of all weapons through the Arab League, and can be used to basically free any country from whatever threat that is really taking place.
And right, I think that sounds great, but what exactly is going to be Sudan's role in that particular issue? Sudan's itself, it's in its own right, they need help.
Yeah.
So how are they going to act?
Well, I think it's a priority. I think the priority here is Libya, because the damage in Libya is going to destroy both countries. We've got a major spread of Daesh soldiers in Libya. Libya as a state has collapsed. They have no control over smuggling of weapons. They have no control over their own citizens in terms of uniting people and having them under one government. You've got a lot of tribes that basically claiming to have a confederal or a federal rule. So there is no control in Libya. At least the situation in Egypt is very much settled. Sudan has a lot of problems too, but I think in terms of priority, we're going to have to attend to Libya quite quickly before that cancer of Daesh spreads in North Africa, because I think we still have a solid front on Egypt's side, but I think if they go towards Tunisia and Algeria, we're going to have more problems if they spread in North of Africa, controlling, if you allow me, the Gibraltar. So we're talking about a border with Spain of width of 15 kilometers. So I think if they take control of that, we're going to have a major trade problem, and it's going to affect the Suez Canal. So in terms of the role of Sudan, I think Sudan will have to support all initiatives to settle the situation in Egypt, in Libya, and on their side, they're going to have to take control over their borders, because smuggling of weapons through the Sudanese land coming from Central Africa and from the Red Sea, ships and so on, I think this is really costing Egypt quite a lot in terms of terrorism, and it's going to cost them as well. So
right. If you allow me, we're only having like 1 minute to go or 2 minutes, but I have one important question that is left for you. There is a clear public Ethiopian support for South Sudan, but there are also circumstantial evidence and some rumors suggesting that Ethiopia is arming and funding the Mashar's insurgency in Sudan. Within this narrative, Sudan's military cooperation with Egypt could be also considered as a good step towards the Sudanese interest too, not only to maintain the cross-border stability. How do you see that? How do you read it?
I think we do have a problem in Ethiopia and in South Sudan, because we've got a lot of Jews, and these people are manipulated by Israel. So you've got a lot of Jews in South Sudan and in Ethiopia, and these people are manipulated by Israel. A lot of their soldiers are actually trained inside Israel, on Israeli soil, occupied Palestine. So I think we're going to have, we've got a major national threat here to Sudan and to Egypt. And like I said earlier, Sudan didn't read that in the beginning and allowed the establishment of South Sudan. But I think it's coming clearer now that South Sudan is not the friend. It is one of the enemies that we really have to watch for, because their ties with Ethiopia can be very dangerous with us. And as I said also earlier, that the increasing the number of countries that in that particular agreement, it's actually going to give us more problems to deal with. So the way forward is a unity and a clear, pure, and a unity between Egypt and Sudan, and it's basically a unity with a vision based on
in the
economic
benefit of Sudan
benefit of both of them,
Egypt.
Political and economic.
And strategic also.
Absolutely.
Right. Dr. Muhanna, the political analyst, would like to thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Coming over to Windows and Current Affairs, and I guess this is where we end this edition of Windows and Current Affairs. Thank you very much for joining us, and please do join us again next week. Until then, that's goodbye.